Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for sticking it out this week, today and yesterday, and joining us for all of our sessions. We really appreciate it. I have a huge pleasure and honor today to be joined on stage with somebody who is a not just expert here in Illinois, but a national expert on a subject that is been important in the housing realm for a long time, but is thankfully starting to get more and more attention on the policy front. I am joined today by Angela Brooks. Angela, yes, please. Angela is the 2024 president of the American Planning Association. So these are licensed professional city and urban planners. They know the organization of cities forwards and backwards. On top of that, she is on the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals, and she is also the Illinois Director for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. So please, again, one more welcome for Angela.
Thank you.
So I know we're going to talk zoning, and we've got quite a session here planned for you, a lot to really dig into. But before we really get into the detail of that, I want everyone to learn a little bit more about you. You have a really extensive background in this area, so maybe help us all learn about how you got to where you are and a little bit about what CSH does.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. Years ago, planners and realtors wouldn't have been having conversations, but as we all know, this housing crisis has really made everybody have to talk about this because we're all in this together. And from an urban planning perspective, our mission is to make great communities where everybody has a place to live. And the history of zoning has somewhat prevented that. So how I entered planning really comes from just flipping through a book when I was in college and seeing, I didn't know what planning was, I didn't know it was a thing, and just being like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting, because I was obsessed with the thought of cities and what makes cities work. And my career is taking me mostly to work in affordable housing. I came to Chicago about 18 years ago, so while I worked as the director of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, prior to that I spent 10 years at Chicago Housing Authority, so I describe myself as a recovering real estate developer. You know, taking 7 years to deliver units got real old, and looking at real estate performance, I was like, I'm over this. So now I work for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and so we're a national nonprofit, but we're also a CDFI, or Community Development Finance Institution. So we do pre-development and acquisition loans for affordable housing development, but we also get an allocation of new market tax credits. So we do a lot of work with communities that have federally qualified health centers, and anything that kind of ties to permanent supportive housing. So we look at how do we end homelessness, but more importantly, here in Illinois, a lot of our work is working with developers who are interested in developing permanent supportive housing and affordable housing throughout the state, and we're funded by IDA to do so.
That's awesome. That's incredible. Certainly has the right background for the subject that we're going to be covering today, so looking forward to digging into it. We are going to as Angela and I talked before our session today, there was this common recognition, not just of the housing supply crisis, but of the role of zoning and some of the planning processes that are in place, the role of those processes on the supply crisis. So we are going to hopefully walk you all through the background on this, how it has affected the housing crisis that we're in today, but then most importantly, hopefully, is leave you with some of the solutions and options that we have to move forward. A sense that there is progress that we can make. There are steps we can take right now that will immediately start to turn the tide on this issue. So without further ado, let's get right into kind of the heart of the issue. And to do that, I think what I think might be good is to actually go back in time. And my understanding is that modern zoning laws are a little over, 100 years old or so, early 1900s. So maybe kind of let's start back quickly on why did cities go to zoning? Why did they feel it was necessary to begin with?
You know, there's lots of conversations now that we're really talking about zoning reform, and depending on how you look at it, it can be very controversial, but zoning really did start in They argue about where it starts, but most regularly documented would have been LA in 1904, and it really started about wash houses and to segregate those from other land uses. The tie-in to that was the race of the people who tended to own those tended to be Chinese immigrants, and that really was the start of it. So the basis of zoning really started as a way to regulate populations of people didn't want to be near. The good intention of zoning, if you will, is to think about things that shouldn't go next to each other. Like most of us probably don't want to live next to a garbage dump facility. So that it did have good purposes, but the intent really did start as a tool of segregation. And so now, it's kind of funny that we use the word modern zoning ordinances, because if you look at cities across the nation, many of them have not updated them in modern times, and how we have lived has shifted very considerably since a lot of ordinances were adopted in the 50s. How many of you live in communities that look the same as they did in 1950? And how many of you live the same way that your parents or grandparents lived? Probably very few of you. So we have not looked at changing our ordinances to reflect how our communities often want to live or are living, or more importantly, need to be developing.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lack of change. Let's talk about how zoning is structured, just on a kind of superficial level. How are zoning codes written? Talking specifically, use types and density types. How are zoning codes used in those ways to put certain things over here and certain people over here? Talk to us about how they're structured so we all have that common understanding.
So the New York Times a few years ago did an article that talked about 75% of the United States is zoned for single-family residential. It's a pretty huge number if you think about it, which is often precluding any other type of uses. And here in the Midwest, I'm originally from Seattle, so it's not as popular, but carriage houses, ADUs, whatever term you want to use, has been a natural kind of development in this area, and so much of this country does not allow that. And so you've got zones that are residential, you've got commercial, you've got industrial, and so most of those kind of make sense. And a lot of the zoning reform, and I'm probably skipping ahead a little bit, that people are talking about when they're talking about specifically around eliminating single-family zoning isn't saying we don't want single-family houses. We're saying in those zones, you should allow other things. So, and I'm not like, if I show up, I live in Chicago, I've never developed anything under 100 units. That's not what I'm saying. I might be saying you should possibly just allow accessory dwelling units by right in every residential zone or even commercial. I might be saying you should let the state of Montana just passed a series of legislation called the Montana Miracle, and they let up to a fourplex go into every residential zone by right. Yeah. And I use Montana as an example because it's not really known for being a really urban state.
Yeah.
Because I can't use Chicago when I'm talking to people in Walla Walla, Washington. They look at me like I'm crazy. So I use that because what they were saying and what the governor and planners and their state legislature decided was, we want to attract industry to our state. We do not have the housing units to do it. These are the types of housing types that would fit into a residential community that would not really change the nature and the culture of that community and how it feels or looks. This is a density that we feel like could work in any community, and we're going to make it easier to do.
Yeah. So you just talked about attracting industry. So going back in time, just taking the housing side of it out of the equation for just a moment, some of the original zoning laws were designed, right, to set aside tracts for certain industry in order to build up a city's kind of economic engine or base.
Absolutely, and depending on how environmentally impactful that industry was, it tended to be in communities that did allow a wider variety of use of housing that tended to be more affordable and predominantly in communities of color.
Right.
And that still exists to this day. And we have a whole movement of environmental justice that started right here in Chicago on the south side at Altgeld Gardens by Hazel Johnson that really talks about environmental justice and how do we really eradicate that and look at the disproportionate health impacts on communities of color based on land use. I mean, at this point in time in this country specifically, your zip code really can impact your outcomes of life because of lack of amenities.
Yeah. And despite knowing that and seeing that, going back to a point you just made a couple minutes ago, is these zoning laws were created sometimes 100 years ago or 80 or 90 years ago, and the underlying structure hasn't really changed all that much. It's still a system of you can't have that here and this has to go here, which has that preclusive effect.
Zoning historically has been a way of zoning out, not zoning in.
Yeah.
And so as we think about how, and specifically how your members can really have an impact. And I can't see any of you, but you guys can kind of shout out. How many of you sit on planning boards or commissions or ZBAs? That is a great way, shout out to whoever said woo, that is a great way that you bring the expertise to those tables, because what's really important is, I am a fan of planning. I think we need to plan. I mean, you shouldn't be shocked by that. But we have to make plans to think about what are the things we think make sense in our communities and how do we make it easier for them to get there. And that is by planning, comprehensive planning, master planning. And that's an expertise area that you all have because you guys know the market better than anybody, because what I know as a recovering developer, I'm not going to build anything I can't rent or sell, right? Who knows that? You all do. And that's an expertise area that often is missing from those boards and commissions. And as a sitting zoning board commissioner, it's definitely something that's missing in a lot of our meetings. So I really encourage all of you to look at how you can get engaged in those processes, because you really do bring a level of expertise that's needed in those kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. I want to go back a little bit to something that you've referred to a couple of times, but I just think it's really important to drive it home and make it really clear about kind of how this all was used and how it worked. Because, it wasn't, I mean, there were some zoning codes that were probably explicitly racist and segregationist.
Yes.
But they weren't all written very on their face that way. So
Absolutely.
Tell us how they could write a zoning code that would have the effect
Absolutely.
without explicitly coming right out and saying it.
My favorite is minimum lot size. If I say your minimum lot size, is 1 unit per acre, for instance.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to happen in a big city, but that certainly eliminates the types of housing. Who can afford that, particularly at the price of square foot right now?
Yeah.
That's a very prescriptive thing to a very prescriptive income level, for sure. That certainly is one. This is one, there's plenty of lawsuits around fair housing, definition of family. We all know that immigrants and people of color often live in larger communities
Sure.
or family, and it's not always biological. I mean, that's just not necessarily how that works. That's definitely limiting, and there's tons of land use law around that specific issue. And those are the two biggest ones that I think are easily rectified and easily identified.
So these codes are written and they effectively use economics to segregate.
Yes.
And we're talking again about a period of the early 1900s when a lot of these really start kind of getting off of the ground as cities start growing. And one thing that I was interested in to learn as the more I've researched this is here, especially in Chicagoland area, but Illinois, we hear a lot about the history of redlining. And redlining is obviously most familiarly connected to loan products for the purchase of homes. But that wasn't until later 30s, 40s, 50s where zoning really was a precursor for it.
Absolutely.
Where it actually was used to move the people into these areas that then allowed these maps to be used in redlining. Is that a fair kind
That's a very fair assessment, and for those of you who nerd out on stuff like that, pulling old zoning maps of some of the areas that you are working, it's quite humbling to really see that and then tie it and add an overlay of racial demographics. You can visibly see it.
Yeah, and that was the part that I just, it was one thing to learn about redlining, or as you learn about it and you think, well, this was just lenders, arbitrarily drawing lines, on a city map. It was the zoning that was done decades before that enabled them to do that. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation to understand. If we're going to talk about where does zoning go, we have to understand that history and acknowledge how it was used
For sure. And
all those years ago.
And we also have to understand zoning is a legal thing. Like planning or comprehensive plans are aspirational. There's no law tied to that. Like when you come to a zoning board hearing, that is a legal court case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll talk about that over drinks, the ZBA. But zoning is it's a police enforcement of a land use policy versus our comprehensive plans or our master plans are aspirational, and that is the main difference. And so once something becomes zoning, that is a law that has to be upheld, and then you have to go through processes to do something outside of that, which makes it extremely difficult, and frankly, it can be expensive. I don't actually know what it costs to go to ZBA right now, but I know it's not free, and I know it is costly because you probably are going to have a lawyer, you're probably going to have a land use consultant. And what I'm saying in zoning reform conversations is if there are things we know that we think are a great idea, we shouldn't have those types of things that further prohibit things we've agreed are what we want in our communities.
So we've established that, how zoning got started, and then some of it's sometimes explicit, but most of the time implicit agendas behind how they were originally designed. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that it wasn't just about where in the city, certain groups of people were segregated to. This had a long-term impact on investments in those neighborhoods, transportation options, and just where the city decided then to allocate resources, right?
Absolutely. There's a huge tie-in to commercial investment into communities. I'm sure most of you are, particularly those of you who do commercial, you look at demographic information on communities. There was a study that Tesca Associates, a planning firm here, did for the city of Olympia Fields. It's probably 10, 15 years ago now, but it was talking about commercial redlining that a lot of people don't think about. And the city manager for Olympia Fields was going to the ICSC conference all the time. And if those of you are not familiar with Olympia Fields, it's fairly high income, probably similar income to Orland, which has great commercial investment. And he was a white guy, and it's a predominantly African-American city, heavily. And he would get meetings because he's a white guy. But then when people would look at the demographics of his city, suddenly they were not interested. Economically they were, and they saw him, but then when they looked at the other stuff, so he had Tesca do a study, and they basically were able to demonstrate commercial redlining for that area, which was eye-opening for me because you do think about it from housing, but you hadn't thought about it from a commercial perspective. But that same would apply for Chicago. You look at the investments in the South and the West Sides, or lack thereof, and it really is tied to the lack of public investment for decades in those cities and in that section of those cities. And it ties to other things. I mean, the social determinants of health is a real thing, and you look at the health outcomes of those communities as well. And so it's all tied in. And those are uncomfortable conversations, particularly in these days where equity conversations get uncomfortable. We've got states that won't allow them, but the fact does remain that systemic barriers have existed and do exist. And for those people who are really committed to moving the needle on communities to move forward together, we do have to address them. And it's not gonna always be, peaches and cream conversations. But it is achievable, and we are starting to see communities that are making a difference and moving the needle to achieve some level of equity in zoning and really see investment come into communities that have been disinvested in for many decades.
Yeah. And I think you just used the word that I think is really important to take away from this part is the word equity. And you hear it a lot, in media today, but understanding what that means and understanding how these decisions from over 100 years ago have all stacked up. And when people say that a community has been disinvested and there's, disparities in equity and generational wealth, hopefully what you're seeing here is how this narrative gets to where we are today. Let's talk a little bit about, the effect of zoning then on actual housing supply. So you mentioned large single-family lot sizes, which obviously has an affordability factor, which can be, influence segregation, but it also has just an affordability factor on the cost of homes and then how many homes can be built. So let's talk about how zoning laws are structured that actually influence the number of housing units that are built.
Absolutely. So one of the, I have my phone because at some point I'm going to need the numbers because I don't remember them, but the American Planning Association has been a supporter of Up for Growth, Housing Underproduction Report. And if any of you haven't seen it, it is kind of a nerdy thing to read, but it's really good to read to really see the numbers. So the U.S. is underproduced by about 4 million units, which is up about 3% from their report in 2022. We're still waiting on 2024. But the most interesting, well, maybe interesting isn't the word. The most noticeable thing for me is it was up about 4% in the suburbs, but it was up almost 50% in rural areas. And often when people think about housing supply, they think about it from a city perspective, but we're seeing our rural areas are really impacted. One of my colleagues, he's from Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Oh, yeah.
And so his parents moved away, but now they've got their first grandkid. They want to move back to Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
There's nowhere for them to buy a house. So they buy land because they're going to build a house. Supply chain issues. They're still waiting, and they've been waiting, and they've been waiting, and their kids, like, they're supposed to move here to help babysit this kid, and the kid's one, and they still don't have anywhere to live. So I'm sure his brother's pretty pissed because he's like, man, I can't get this free help, and I'm paying for daycare. And so, you know, because of this, suddenly housing and increasing housing is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
How we pay for it gets very partisan, but the fact remains it is a bipartisan issue, and everybody's looking at it because it's no longer just an urban issue, it's no longer a north issue, it's no longer a south issue. We're crunching here, and it's an international thing. I've been to conferences throughout the world over the last year talking specifically about housing supply, and right now we're not meeting the need in any country in the world to meet housing, and if you add in an affordability factor, it's even worse.
So I know there's a lot, you know, when we talk about zoning reform, there's a lot of focus on the single family component of it, and we'll keep talking about that here in a minute, but even closer to urban centers, there's, you know, there are conversations to be had about, you know, things like bulk regulations, right? And how that, you know, relatively simple concepts like limiting the height of a building or the maximum height of a building or limiting the total amount of square footage of a lot that you can actually build on. And tell me if I get any of it wrong, but effectively those are bulk regulations that you're now capping the total number of units that could be put out there in the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's zoning reform, it's building code reform, because most people, no matter if you're in a city or suburb that has a commercial district, people aren't back at work quite, so looking at how do we convert some of this commercial to residential. Some of our building codes aren't going to allow that, so we need to look at our building codes. My favorite topic of all times is parking. You know, we in this country we have space for about 4 billion parking spots, but only 2.5 million cars. So we literally are reserving more spaces for parking, and I do have a car, than we are for housing. And so we really have to look at that, because again, developers are not going to propose no parking if they needed to sell or rent those units. So there's some things that the market can help determine. I use the example for those of you familiar with Chicago, 43rd and Green is a 100-unit development that's at the Green Line at 43rd, developed by P3 and the Habitat Company. And I live not too far from there, and everybody I know has a car, and they have like 5 parking spots. It's a very low parking spot, but they are next to the train. I was like, it's not going to work. I knew it wasn't going to work. Well, what I know is they were fully leased before they even had 1 iota of a building built. And they're on phase 2, which is also almost fully leased, and they're not done. And they have no parking. And so clearly, the market is telling us that some of our thoughts around parking and transit-oriented to development is working. Yeah. And we need to sometimes get out of the way. And I've heard, I always love hearing the new commissioner for the Department of Planning in the city of Chicago, Sierra Boatwright, talk about this. And she's like, the Cut the Tape initiative, how do we get out of the way, and what are those things? And so we've got to really look at how do we remove some of the red tape that has existed, not because it makes sense, but because we just haven't changed it and updated it to reflect how we live today. Right.
You mentioned cars a few times, and so I think that that's another element of this entire zoning conversation that's important is we've all heard the concept of sprawl, and that was really kind of born out of the single-family zoning lot. And one interesting, you know, as I was researching this, one interesting data point that I found was that in the Chicagoland area between 1970 and 1990, the overall population had been growing in the early 20th century, but then it really kind of leveled off. And over that 20-year period, it actually was a population decline for a certain number of years. But overall, in that 20-year period, there was only like a 1, 2, maybe 2.5% increase in population. But the geographic footprint of the city of Chicago increased in that same time period by 25%. And that's by and large due to this single-family lot and sprawl. And the point of all of that is there are these other effects of sprawl besides land consumption. Like the over-reliance on cars, we are in a state that is trying to prioritize green energy and trying to prioritize the environment, but zoning kind of works against that sometimes, doesn't it?
It can, and I think we also have to rethink how we live. Any of you who've been to Europe, I mean, some of these conversations don't even exist. And how we've designed our cities, like, I'm originally from Seattle, and Seattle's population has gotten ridiculous, and Seattle has very narrow streets, so it's actually kind of inconvenient to drive, and they're a bike-friendly city, and I'm a cyclist. Lots of bike lanes, so I was just home last week, I was like, man, Dad, you're gonna have to learn how to ride a bike, because it's actually becoming difficult to drive. But it's a rethinking on how we allocate land and how we live and how we use. And I will always say, particularly around parking, there are smaller cities that are looking at parking regulations. Sandpoint, Idaho is probably around, I don't know, 30,000 people. They were doing a bank in downtown, and it had like, there was a city-owned lot for 200 spots a block away, and they were gonna have to do like 100 parking spots for the bank to be developed. It was a historic building, and I mean, it didn't make sense because there was this big lot a block away. And so it made them start thinking about their parking regulations, and so they, for the most part, got rid of minimum parking requirements in the downtown and throughout the whole city. But that one development is what triggered that, and that's a relatively small city that's really looking at that, because they recognize that, do we need that many parking spots, or do we need to be doing other things in our commercial corridor? Yeah,
especially as more and more, as younger generations do occupy, urban centers, and they want less reliance on vehicles. And so I think that there's just, to your point of, it's been decades since anyone has bothered to rethink any of this. I do think that one silver lining, and we can talk more about some solutions here in a minute, but it does seem to be a trend to looking at transit-oriented development, like you just mentioned, where that is starting to break through at, okay, maybe we need to rethink how people are getting around and whether or not we need to have the reliance on vehicles or the reliance on a lot of parking lots.
Absolutely, and I mean, you're seeing new technologies even around, every city's not going to have a mass transit system with trains, but you're starting to see many cities, small and medium cities, look at bus rapid transit and all of those things that incorporate better bus service and faster bus service, because most of us don't want to ride the bus because it takes forever. But if you can implement BRT and these transit options that really do trigger faster bus service, it makes it a little bit more amenable to do.
Sure.
If it doesn't, tie it. If it's not faster to drive, I would love to take the train or a bus, because then I can read, I can return the calls I never return, listen to my voicemail, do my emails. But if it takes longer to drop, so I think we're going to see a change in all of those things as our technologies get better around transit, and access to transit becomes a priority as well.
And I think, like you said, it's not just the Chicagos of the world. It's not just the big cities. It's the suburbs and even the more what you would consider rural areas, smaller towns across the state that are looking at enhancing their transportation options for this exact purpose.
Yeah, I think when we start thinking about housing supply, very often people think about new residents, but it's not necessarily new residents. So you have your parents, they have a big old house. They love their neighborhood. They want to sell their house and move, but there's nothing smaller, or there's no condo with an elevator or something that is more reflective of their need. So they stay in their house. Sorry, I'm talking about a personal experience from my dad right now. Because there's nowhere he can go, or he lives in Seattle, there's nowhere he can afford. And so it's not always new residents you're thinking about. We're accommodating existing residents, or your child wants to move back. There's not a starter home in their community, or you've got my dad sitting there holding one. And we've got to start thinking about it as opposed to not just, it's not always about the new, it's about creating a space for the existing residents and having a housing diversity. And a diversity of housing allows everyone an opportunity to live somewhere. And that's not what we see in a lot of our communities. And that's really what zoning reform conversations are about, and how we have to frame them in terms of creating additional housing diversity that accommodates a wider variety of people in our communities.
I think a lot of the folks in this room who were working through COVID, that became an even more real issue when older generations decided to age in place and decided not to whether it was retire south or downsize, and that created even more, in addition to the already overheating market during that time, it created even more demand because now you have younger generations who are forced to now leave those towns because there's nowhere for them to go, because the older generations are staying put. So I think that became a lot more real for a lot of the members the last several years. You mentioned this earlier, and I think it's a really important point to bring up, and that's kind of political will. I know planners have talked about zoning for years. We and the National Association have been talking about it for years, but it seems to be that there's a growing consensus and political will finally,
Yes.
on both sides of the aisle to at least have this conversation anyway. Maybe the solutions differ a little bit, but from the planners side of things, is that what you guys are seeing and experiencing as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in this field for a long time, and for the first time in my career, I've heard a president use the word zoning. Hadn't had that before. The Housing Supply Affordability Act.
At a national convention. No,
yeah.
Yeah.
The Housing Supply Affordability Act is really exciting. The pro-housing grants that are that came out and hopefully will be going forward in fiscal year 25 are really exciting because a lot of communities want to do it, but they don't have the funding to do so. And so if you want to have zoning reform and you want to have people look at their particularly smaller jurisdictions that don't have huge, robust planning staff, it's not cheap to do. And so providing funding for them to do so and to really look at that is hugely important. When we start thinking about zoning reform and housing, expanding attainable housing, if you will, providing some technical support is really, really important.
Yeah.
There's lots of conversations in the country about state preemption, which is very scary for a lot of people. So I'm never suggesting that, just in case somebody but there are states that are doing that, and just kind of looking at what's working and what we have seen. And I use Minneapolis because it's just like one of the larger cities that had a huge court battle. We are seeing increased affordability, decrease in homelessness, all of those things that have really come from a comprehensive plan that it really gave them a lot more options in zoning to provide a wider diversity of housing.
Yeah. I thought it was incredible watching the convention that was just here in Chicago a few weeks ago, and to watch President Obama gets on stage, President Biden gets on stage, VP Harris gets on stage, and they're all talking about housing, and
Absolutely.
To finally be like, yes, finally, we've finally gotten this on your radar has been a relief. Obviously now the hard part gets to making the details work.
More than 20 states that have adopted state level reforms on zoning specifically in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
And that says a lot about the need to providing housing diversity, because the number one issue most people are trying to solve for is the Housing Supply Act and lack of, and creating a different type of housing that allows more people to be able to live there. And so as we see that, we're going to start having real data. I'm a planner, so I'm a nerd. I like numbers, and numbers really, I can show you better than I can tell you. So when we start seeing the outcomes in those areas, that helps move the needle for other communities to feel comfortable. But most importantly, the people that often have the loudest mic aren't always right, but they're the ones who show up. Yeah. And so we've got to be, as planners, we have to be more intentional in bringing other people into the room. And as somebody who sits at a zoning board hearing at the third Friday of every month, I'm starting to see a shift in who's showing up. I'm starting to see the YIMBY show up. I'm starting to see the people who are advocating for a different type of housing in their communities. I'm starting to see real estate associations, all these other organizations who didn't always come in those ways show up, because we all recognize the need for us to work together to really provide some solutions. And it's looking good. We just, and I think we're going to get to this, so I'll just jump ahead. Over the last year and a half, we APA, the National League of Cities, the National Realtors, the National Home Builders, National Mortgage Association, and a bunch of government partners have been getting together to talk about them. We've had a housing supply accelerator, so we've had 5 convenings in May. We released the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook, which I encourage all of you to download and get a copy. And the reason I say that is it really looks at, these are some things that are working to increase housing supply, but more importantly, it has case studies of what's working in other cities. And it also has a playbook on how you can implement that process in your own communities to come up with a playbook to move the needle in your community and what those partnerships look like. And we had some real interesting conversations because realtors, home builders, and finance people and planners and elected leaders in one room.
The cities were involved too,
yeah,
right?
we had elected leaders from NLC. Some real interesting conversations of people who often all of our policy people laugh. They often said, we're always on the Hill and we never agree, so it's great to be in a room to talk about some stuff we can't agree on. And so the playbook came up with some solutions that were pretty much vetted with all the people who would have different opinions, if you will.
Yeah.
So some of those really uncomfortable conversations were held to come up with a usable playbook that communities can use, and more importantly, it highlights what communities are doing throughout the country.
Yeah, so I want to kind of unpack the playbook and let's kind of, that you were just referring to, let's talk though about that one component, and the National League of Cities was one of the collaborative partners on that. And I'm just curious that, it's one thing to talk about financing options and access to capital, and that's a real issue. But when you start talking zoning, now you can really raise the defenses of local elected leaders. So I'm just curious, what was the response from that group? Was it's all defense, or was it a more open-mindedness?
Depended on the day. No, I think at the end of the day, what everybody recognized is what we're currently doing isn't working. So when you start there, and the why is where the distinctions happen. And I should back up and say, when we were choosing the steering committees from both APA and the National League of Cities made sure it was bipartisan representation, large and small cities, and we did as well. So we had a representation widely throughout the whole United States, large, small cities, and in their case, Republican, Democrat, independents, all making sure not one person was kind of having the mic, which is great. And there are people that are in parts of the country where climate is an issue, whether or not they talk about it in that way, and all of those things. So talking about resiliency was a thing as well. And so a lot of the elected leaders, their point of view is always, it's really cute that you planners are theoretical, because you're a civil service employee. If you do something and they hate it, you're not really going to lose your job, but we will. And so that was a reality that sometimes as a policy person we don't think about. So it was nice to have their perspective. It also made us think about, often, particularly when you talk about eliminating single-family zoning, or you make the mistake of using the word increasing density, people are going to have a visceral response. And so it made us be very intentional in thinking about what is it we're saying and showing it. Because really, when I'm saying eliminating single-family zoning, I'm usually probably just saying you should allow ADUs and you should let a duplex in. But that's not what people see. They see my 100-unit development at Southbridge on Cermak and State. You know what I mean? Like, that's what they see.
Yes.
And so making sure that we're demonstrating, so when I'm talking, behind me is a picture of a duplex, and maybe it's a picture of a fourplex, but it looks like a single family house, because that is very doable, and that probably isn't even noticeable. And frankly, in most communities, you've probably driven past one and didn't realize it. But that's not what people see. And so making the intentionality on how we communicate was really important. And that's what the elected leaders brought. And at the end of the day, it's like, give us some cover, give us some data, give us the numbers. And again, that goes to my point of what you all bring to the table in those conversations is you bring the data and the numbers and the market.
Yeah, let's zero in on some of the things that you just said in terms of options, because I think this is important, is you will see headlines where you see a city or a state take on zoning. You will inevitably see a headline that, such and such city or state is going to eliminate all single family zoning, when in reality, it's much more nuanced than that, and there's a range of options to consider. So let's just, so that everyone understands and is kind of on the same page, with the definitions, let's just go through a few of these. You've mentioned ADUs a few times. Chicago has now started to permit ADUs on a somewhat limited basis. I know they're trying to talk about a more permanent basis. But talk just about ADUs specifically, and how that could be a very quick injection of new housing supply.
Absolutely. I mean, so one, I will throw out a resource for those of you who are interested in your communities, the American Planning Association and AARP. I'm now eligible, so that's interesting in itself. But nevertheless, they've come up with some model ordinances, ADU templates that communities can use, and some bulk regulations and design guidelines that cities can literally just borrow and adapt. And AARP's perspective on it is that whole point of aging in place. Let's give our elders an opportunity to, maybe they move out of their house and they move to the back and let their kid have it, you know, or maybe they need the income that could be generated from, because my friend in San Francisco had to get an ADU to afford his mortgage, you know, so those are the types of options. So those are the types of things that are a resource out there. And so when people are talking about eliminating single family zoning, what they're not saying is you can't have a single family house. That's not what it means at all. You do whatever you want when you own the land. But what they are saying is if you have a single family lot in a house and you want to add an accessory dwelling unit, or if it's a free land and maybe it's saying we will let you build a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. So it's important that you dig into what the actual code is saying, because what it isn't saying is you can't have a single family house.
Right.
And that's often what the messaging is, but that's not what it means.
Yeah.
It's just saying we are not going to restrict you to this one thing in this one zone any longer, and we're going to open that up.
Right. Just broadening some of those categories of what is residential for
Absolutely.
that zone. Yeah.
And often another battle is allowing residential in some commercial zones, which is generally another prohibited use.
Yes.
But, you know, people seem to like living downtown, y'all. They're loving it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff downtown that's empty right now, so it would seem that if somebody can make the numbers work, and we're starting to see it in Chicago and other cities, and I'm sure the mayor of DC with all those vacant federal buildings now would love to see it in DC, we're gonna start seeing a demand for that type of reuse of these commercial buildings.
The repurposing and reuse, I think, is another important one. You talked about parking. The other thing about single family lots, though, I wanted to get you to weigh in on is sometimes it's not even about increasing density on a lot, but just shrinking the lot size requirement altogether.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the bulk regulations on height and width it's a whole other bailiwick, but we've got to start thinking about, and I think some of those codes really were based a lot on perceived health and safety. And so as we've kind of looked at the types of building materials and supplies, some of these fire departments are thinking differently about some of those setbacks that have been traditionally there too. So it's about really looking at what is required now, what that looks like. I mean, Chicago's always had pretty narrow setbacks in some ways, but some cities haven't. And so just really thinking about what is really necessary and what is it you're trying to accomplish, and being honest about what that is. But certainly looking at smaller lot sizes gives a lot more options for the number of houses and the type of houses that can be built. And row houses and townhouses is becoming way more popular in a lot of areas, but there are still areas of cities that wouldn't even allow that. And that's a pretty common development that we're starting to see to expand options in communities, and desirable for a lot of people.
Yeah, because I think that that's something that, you know, also kind of gets, you mentioned building codes, but it also kind of gets overlooked is, look, if your community is one that still wants to have a preference for single family lots, you can still have your single family neighborhoods, but there's no reason they need to be on, you know, 7,500 square foot lots. And you would make it a lot more economically feasible for your builders and developers if you shrink those lot sizes, or you consider things like some of the code requirements regarding, you know, building on slabs or having basements, and all those types of requirements. So all of those are also just in this huge range of options to consider.
Yeah, there's a wide variety, and you know, I think the bigger point that I always try to make is there's a whole toolkit of things and options that you can pull from as you need that reflect your community. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And so at the end of the day, it's like we've got to pull everything out of the hat bag to really solve for how do we create more inclusive communities and diversity of housing so more people can afford to live in communities. Because the fact remains, the vast majority of this country under a certain age are not going to be able to purchase a house at the rate we're going. And the transferring of wealth in this country primarily is still through property ownership. And so we have to be realistic about what that looks like. And there's this growing demographic of people who don't also want to own. And so we've got to think about how are we creating rental options that provide for that, for people who can afford it or not, that want to rent. And so we still have some communities that prohibit apartments outright. And so we know that's problematic, and we've got to think about what that might look like and how do we see it differently, but how do we shift the thought process on what housing and how living looks like in this country to really kind of look like some other countries that have been doing this successfully for a really long time. And you know, we also have to think about how do we use public-owned land. I mean, some of the largest property owners for sure in Chicago is the Chicago Housing Authority. And so how do we repurpose public-owned land to help solve some of this? And so if we know solving for land cost is a big issue on cost right now, particularly for new builds. So if we start looking at reusing publicly owned land in ways to create affordable housing options in a way that is timely, and then, you know, we also have to start looking at permitting times, because I mean, waiting on a permit sometimes, why left development, y'all can have that for those of you developers out here. I mean, it's just, it's painful and it's unnecessarily expensive. Particularly, you're asking construction companies to hold costs for ridiculous amounts of time. I don't know how construction companies haven't just balked and said, forget it, because it's taking too long. So we have to, again, think about things we think are good in our communities, things we're going to prioritize and plan for. We need to expedite how we allow them to happen in our communities through zoning, through permitting, all of those things, and thinking about what that process could look like to do it different.
Yeah, so you obviously, you're not just involved in the conversation nationally, but also in Chicago. So I was going to ask, you know, you talked about permitting, the red tape. It does seem like there's at least some, maybe slow, but some movement on that subject, right?
Yeah, I mean, Chicago's, you know, I mean, people can have whatever opinions they want about the city of Chicago and whoever is elected, but right now the Cut the Tape initiative has been a fairly inclusive process in bringing a lot of people. I know Carr has been really engaged in that. Members have been giving a lot of expert testimony on looking at how do we cut the tape. And, you know, I've seen the directors talk about to their staff, their frontline staff, because once you're at the commissioner level, you don't know, you don't do that. Like, what are the things you think we do that we can help remove some of these barriers to getting things done? Or as Sierra Boatwright always says, how do we get to yes faster? And so asking those questions to the people who are doing the work daily is very refreshing to see. I've not seen it in my time here, and I've been here 18 years, so it's great to see. And to even say we're going to have a Cut the Red Tape initiative from a bureaucrat is fairly impressive.
Right.
And, you know, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see some real barriers removed in Chicago specifically, because of all the cities in the state, I imagine they're probably one of the slower ones to get things done, including even getting on the ZBA. I mean, the ZBA hearings are painful. I mean, I have one tomorrow, and I'm trying to mentally prepare, because what I can tell you is our hearings often are 12 hours.
Oh, Lord.
There's absolutely nothing you could be building near me that I care enough that I'm going to sit there for 12 hours to give you testimony. I can tell you that right now. And so what I know is our public engagement process also hasn't changed, because asking a community person to sit there, because I can't really tell you what time you're going to show up, so asking you to take a day off work, come downtown Chicago, park, catch the train, whatever, and just sit there indefinitely.
While you're paying your attorney.
Yeah. Or if you just want to testify, like, there's nothing you could be building that I'm doing that for. There's just nothing.
Yeah.
Like, nothing. And so, and so our public engagement process, we have to think about that too, and how do we get true engagement from a wider variety? Because it's also a privilege. Like, I have vacation time, so if I cared enough, which I don't, I could take a day off work, get paid, and sit there. But a lot of people in our communities, particularly who are getting things that probably have things they would care enough about to be there, don't have that privilege. So it's a privilege to sit there.
Yeah.
And we're not hybrid. Like, you know, I think COVID showed us the virtual world expanded the ability for people to participate and have less impact on whatever else they might need to do. And I was very impressed at the number of people that we saw. Wasn't impressed with the length of some of our meetings, but it definitely allowed more people to participate and not have to deal with all those other obstacles to participate. Yeah. And it's a well-intentioned process, right? Yeah. But how we live is just really, really different.
So we've talked about, you used the word toolbox earlier. We've talked about that there seems to be more political will towards making progress on this. Chicago seems to be making progress, albeit slowly. So let's talk a little bit about that toolbox, though, and specifically the playbook.
Absolutely.
Which my understanding is designed to walk anybody who has an interest in this at the city level through how you can affect change.
It is probably the most, okay, so for those of you who are not Christian, I apologize, but it's the easiest way for me to explain it. A lot of policy stuff is written in the King James version of the Bible, which who can understand this? Well, this is written in the Message version, right? Like at the 5th grade level. So it's written for anybody to be able to understand and implement, because I swear, reading a zoning ordinance, first of all, you probably want to just jump off of a bridge,
Yeah.
but you can't understand half of it. And so when they were writing the playbook, they're like, how do we write something that's user-friendly for community residents, elected leaders, and planners, but so that everybody can understand what we're saying. So it's in plain language, it's user-friendly, but the case studies even more so are super, super helpful.
Yeah.
And we want it to be something that's not just something you stick on a shelf like every other similar thing, but something you pull out and use and really implement some things. Or if you're a citizen and you happen to find it because you're, I don't know, Googling some random thing and it pops up, you can go to your planning department and say, hey, this is working in Walla Walla, Washington. We should try it here, and here's a way to do so. Because one of the things we have to recognize is changing zoning code is not easy. It's usually not, it's pretty expensive, and you probably have to have 1,000 consultants. So model ordinances and things of that nature do help cities, particularly those that don't have robust planning staff or money for consultants to be able to do so. So it probably is one of the more exciting things that has come out of APA in a while, and the partnerships that have come together to create it. I mean, I was on the stage at the National Home Builders Conference. Interesting experience, but never before would planners and home builders been on the same page long enough for them to invite the president to be on the stage, for sure. That is usually a pretty adversarial relationship, but understanding that we literally are in this together, and it's going to take all of us to solve it was a big pivotal point for all of us to get that playbook done, and really exciting.
And it's customizable, right? Like,
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter where your city's at in the process or how bad your code is versus someone else's. It really is designed where you can find what the most logical start point is for your community.
Absolutely, and you can also find a starting point if none of those things work. It gives you a playbook on how you could implement an accelerator for your community to kind of develop your own, which I think is equally important, because it's nice to be able to pull those same people together in your community to talk about the local issues specific, because sometimes everybody's not thinking of the same things, and you address things that your point of view might have brought up that I wouldn't have thought of. So that was also a really great point about the convenings that we held.
What do you think, just as we kind of start to wrap up and kind of tie a bow on this, as a planner, all your years of experience, all your involvement in all things zoning, what do you think? Do you think that we finally have enough momentum to actually affect real change zoning, not just in Illinois, but nationwide, and that's going to make a dent in housing?
Absolutely. I think that it's hard to say that the housing crisis is a good thing. So the good thing that has come from it is everybody is trying to address it.
Yeah.
From rural America to suburban America to the large cities, we are all experiencing this crunch, and it's impacting us all in very similar ways. And it's probably impacting rural America even more at this moment than the cities. And it's making us all talk about it. And I mean, I remember having a conversation maybe last year with a Republican representative in Arkansas, and he was like, I'm just trying to figure out how I get more housing, because Walmart has killed this whole region of Bentonville, and we need more housing. And, and he was like, and I wish I had thought about it 10 years ago, because the growth that this area has experienced, we hadn't planned for. And, I'm always selling planners and the need for you to hire them. So it was a great message for, yes, this is why planning is needed. So, we've missed the boat in some areas. And so we've got to, really kind of play catch up in some areas. But there are some areas that are still reasonably affordable, but if they don't address it now, they're going to be the Seattle, San Franciscos of the world, where you have to pretty much give up every organ to afford to buy a house or be a tech millionaire. So, I think the good thing that has come out of this current crisis, as opposed to previous crises that are more tied to, interest rates are a contributing factor right now, but supply is a specific issue that we know there are barriers to increasing supply, and we have to address it. And I think the federal pro-housing grants that are going into cities, the Housing Supply Affordability Act, and all of these legislative things on the national level are great, but then just seeing states take action, and then seeing, there's probably like 45 cities right now that are looking at zoning reform, and just, it's a trending topic. There's a hashtag Plan Talk, the planners of TikTok, which are not necessarily urban planners, but they're really addressing the types of issues in cities that we've got to solve for. And it's really showing that particularly millennials and beyond, they are not really here for these two different city experiences that people are having. And equity is really a big issue in ensuring that, I think at the end of the day, we have to ensure that communities are providing housing options for anybody that wants to live there. And what that could look like is different from every city, and allowing space and place for that to happen is really important.
Yeah. I think there's just this recognition too, like you just said, of, the Arkansas representative of, these decisions that were made a long time ago are now are giving the situation that we're in. And so if we don't want it to get exponentially even worse, then we have to start making those decisions now.
Absolutely.
To affect the long-term future. So we're not looking at a one-year comprehensive plan. We have to be looking far into the future on these things.
Absolutely. I mean, by the time all the lawsuits settled from Minneapolis 2040, which was the plan that started their zoning reform, I mean, we're getting closer to that than we aren't. So we've got to be looking at what do our cities need to look at in 25 years. We've got population projections for those. We know what that is, and we know that we can't house them. When you start looking at the affordability, I just read a statistic, I think it was Habitat, I can't remember now, but they were saying we need to be producing 96,000 affordable units per year worldwide to meet the affordable housing need. Y'all know that ain't happening here. Yeah. You certainly know it's not happening in some of these other places, so we know we're going to be in a housing crisis for the foreseeable future unless we start solving that. And so we need, and I'm an affordable housing developer. I work in homelessness. I am all about the affordable, but the reality of it is, and I use myself as an example, I have not purchased a home here yet, and if any of y'all find a cheap one, maybe talk to me when interest rates go down. But nevertheless, I'm a cog in the wheel. I live in an apartment that is $1,200 a month. I'm a gentrifier. I just happen to be black. I live in Washington Park neighborhood of Chicago. I make 3 or 4 times the census tract income in my neighborhood. I could afford a more expensive place, but I'm not because it doesn't make any sense. But the point remains, there's not a market rate alternative that I'm comfortable purchasing. So I'm sitting in a comfortably affordable unit that somebody that actually needs it could. And so if we don't solve for the me's of the world, they're screaming down here and I'm sitting in their unit. And I would feel bad about it, but I mean, I ain't paying $2,500 for a studio. That's just stupid. But the point being, I mean, people do it. It's not going to be me. But the point being, there are plenty of us that have nowhere to go. And we can go down, but they can't go up. And so we've got to start really addressing the market rate or lack thereof market rate alternatives as well. And never in my career of being an affordable housing developer did I think I would be advocating for more market rate units, but I recognize that
feeds this supply, right?
Yeah, it's a cycle, and I'm a cog in the wheel.
Yes,
I literally am the cog. Sorry, folks.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's good, like you said, if we're going to try to take a silver lining out of this housing crisis or the inventory crisis that we're in, is number one is it is finally on the radar of the policymakers and the ones who we need to help make these decisions. The other is you right now are talking to one of the most politically active groups of professionals in the entire state, if not the country. And our members are known for having relationships with their mayors, their city councilmen and women. And I think this playbook, the Accelerator Supply Playbook, is such an incredible tool or resource to all of our members who they don't need to wait on anybody else. They can take this and go right to their friend that's the mayor, or their friend that's a alderman or woman, and start taking action on this.
Absolutely, and I think the best part about it is having case studies from a wide variety of cities and towns and villages. And the key point, because that's all sizes of organizations, because again, most people I'm gonna take my Chicago butt and be like, she's not talking about, no, you don't want what I'm talking about, but hey, here you go, Cedar Point, there's Colorado Springs. I mean, there's a wide variety of case studies. And I think, having something that works is an easier, more palatable way for an elected official to feel comfortable. Because that's some coverage. But, I think at the end of the day, having people who are experts in the actual real estate market giving ideas and testimony and really participating in the process on these boards and commissions that impact how land is used in your communities is really imperative. So I really encourage you, those of you in communities, to step up in those ways. And if you don't want to sit on the meetings, because again, not all ZBAs are as painful as ours in Chicago, but I encourage you to consider volunteering for those boards and commissions because you bring a perspective that is ultimately really, really needed to help kind of think about what are these plans. And if you don't want to be on the board, at least participate in the process and give expert testimony, even when it's not explicitly asked for. Because sometimes people will reach out, I'm sure. You probably get requests, but you live in those communities, you hear about it and participate in the process. But more importantly, talk to your neighbors and friends. You're on the golf course, you're at dinner, you're at brunch, and you hear people that are talking about, oh, I don't want this apartment, I don't want that. Talk about who that's looking for. Because the reality is most people who are looking at expanding housing supply, they're not talking about the people I work to house, because that's a whole different conversation when you're housing shelters and permanent supportive housing. You're talking about teachers, firefighters, you're talking about the Trader Joe's workers, you're talking about workforce and missing middle, and that's the reality, but that's not what people see. And so we've got to be more intentional on really talking about who it is that we're housing. And I'm not saying that who I work for, I mean, who I'm housing is not important, but the reality is that's generally not what we're talking about. And people, that's not what people are seeing. So be partners in moving the needle on creating the communities that you know the people that you work for and you are providing housing for are looking for.
I think that's a perfect way to kind of wrap this up. I just want to say thank you to Angela for joining us and sharing all of her insight and expertise and helping us become better educated on this. Like I said, we have an army that can really tackle this issue, and so that's what we're looking forward to contributing to the conversation. So please help me and thank you.